Okay, so we just generally have named this Let's Talk About Culture, Rules, and Bias in Everyday Life. Culture Hour is a casual forum for students, faculty, staff on insights, questions, and concerns about culture. So just a little bit about myself, very quick overview. My interest began when I was in grade school. We hosted immigrants. I was in a Catholic community and we had some immigrants from Vietnam. And then I was studying Spanish and French in high school and heard all about France and really wanted to travel. That piqued my interest. And so during college, I was able to have kind of a casual study abroad during the summer of my junior year. And that was really when I just became so enthralled with culture. Even though Belgium, is a Western culture, it was still very different to me. And I decided that I wanted to do more. So after I graduated from college, I joined the Jesuit International Volunteers and I went to the tiny island of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia, where I taught English and eventually I married a Pohnpeian and we have children together. I have since divorced and I'm remarried, and we have a very ethnically, culturally mixed family, with some of our children being African American, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, Irish, and Brazilian Irish. So I bring a lot of different perspectives to the table. I taught ESL for 20 years, and I've been in an administrative role working with internationals coming, into the country and people going out of the country. And so I'm very fortunate in that I interface with a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people. Having said that, I don't claim to be any type of expert on any given culture except for myself. And that is one thing that we talk a lot about, is that culture is really about yourself. Sometimes when we mention culture, people want to talk about it as, something really exotic, far away in Africa, right, Kwame? But really, it's me. It's the way I see the world. So we'll first start with a question for all of us here, the six of us. In your own words, when you hear culture, like, what do you think? What is culture? And you can just unmute yourself and shout that out, or you can put it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. What is culture?
Can I go first?
Yeah, Kwame, go ahead.
Okay, so for me, I think it is the way of life. A certain group of people do their things. That's how I think
Yes,
culture is.
I love that. A way of life, the way certain people do things. Fantastic. What else?
Just kind of their beliefs. I agree with
Yes.
Juana, just the way they go about life and interact with their families, friends, even strangers. And that's the kind of way I look at it. Also, Ryan said in the chat that he just doesn't have camera and microphone ability. So I just want to let you guys know that he said that in the chat.
You don't have access to the chat? Is that what you said, Cooper?
Oh, sorry. I was saying Ryan doesn't have camera or microphone access right now. He
Thank
doesn't
you.
have access to one.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Ryan. Ryan, if you have anything you want to add, please put it in the chat. I'll be better about checking it, and Alexa will too. Yes, Cooper. So both you and Kwame, what you said, 100%, right? Beliefs are a really big part of culture. How we interact with others. So have any of you heard of the iceberg metaphor of culture? Is this a familiar kind of cultural idea? Cooper, you said
I think
yes.
so.
Kwame said no. So Cooper, just you're familiar with it. What does that mean if someone said, "Oh, this is the iceberg of metaphor of culture"? Why do you think we use an iceberg metaphor for culture?
It's kind of a way to describe like 90% of the iceberg is underwater. We only see 10% of what's on the surface. So there's just like so much more hidden behind the surface of a culture.
Exactly. So that's perfectly said. So when an iceberg, we know that only 10% of it is above the water. So very often we use this expression in English and in America, the tip of the iceberg. That's just the tip of the iceberg, meaning that the most of it is below the surface, what you cannot see. This is a great metaphor for culture because very often what we can see is the easy part of culture, maybe like the way people dress and the things that we see, like food that they cook, the music they listen to, their traditional dances, those type of things. We typically don't have a lot of opinions about that, and it's not offensive to us. It's just like, oh, that's part of their culture. That's really nice. That's the kind of the easy part of culture, because it doesn't impact like any of our expectations. So I don't know. We'll just talk a little bit about Edward T. Hall. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he's the one who developed the cultural iceberg model. And he wrote a book, Beyond Culture. So if you're interested in culture, his books are really interesting. I love them. And he's a respected anthropologist who studied culture and intercultural communication. And so basically, just to summarize again what I said, the external or conscious part of culture is what we can see, and that is the tip of the iceberg, and it includes behaviors and maybe some beliefs, but the internal or subconscious part of culture is below the surface of a society. And like you said, Cooper, that's where it includes most of the values, beliefs, and thought patterns that underlie behavior. So this is one diagram that was put together by IFS Intercultural Programs, and it kind of just lists out for you to visually see what some of those examples might be. Tip of the iceberg being like literature, some of the things I mentioned, like music, cooking, games, dress. So that's what you can actually see and interact with, and it really doesn't touch on beliefs as much as below the surface and our thoughts and our beliefs of beauty, notions of adolescence, time, relationships. These are really important to us. And this is where we can get into situations where I say where cultures bump, because in a lot of these situations, we hold on to something that we believe is true, right? We believe there is a way or a truth, and that's where we can sometimes bump up against each other. But for me, while this could be the most challenging part of culture, this is where it gets really interesting, right? So just real quickly, a quote from Hall. He said, "We must take the time to get to know individuals from that culture and interact with them," meaning we need to be able to spend time in a culture and observe and see in order to understand why people are doing what they're doing. So let's just take a moment to share a little bit about ourselves before we go into a case scenario. So culture is about you. So we begin learning culture from the time we're very young, when we're babies. That's the beginning of learning about culture. And basically what we learn from our family, our parents, our family, and then it extends out and out as we get older, is the rules by which we live. And because we're learning these rules, that this is the way to do something, we don't do this, that creates our expectations. Because if I know that this is the rule, then I apply that rule to Alexa, and I apply that rule to Kwame, and I apply that rule to Cooper. And so it sets up an expectation of how I think Cooper should act and how I think Kwame should respond. So culture, rules, and expectation are all one and the same. So from that, I'd like to know, just tell me briefly about what you think your culture is. What formed your culture? Let's just share as a group. If you can unmute yourself and just tell us, what cultural groups do you belong to?
So Ryan said, culture to me are all the things that influence how we live and how we express ourselves in our day to day.
Yes, 100%. And what are some of the influences on your culture? Like, who made you who you are? What cultural groups do you belong to? Just unmute yourself. I can start. So I am the third child in a family of 10. I'm Irish Catholic. And growing up in a family of 10 is a different culture than growing up in a family where there's only one child. Growing up as an Irish American Catholic, there's a lot of what I've learned. It comes from that identity, right? As an Irish Catholic American, I belong to the culture of big families, of women. I'm a woman, so I identify as a woman. I am a sister. I am a daughter. I am a mother. I'm also a mother of 9 children. And we are a blended family, which is a little bit different than, a different culture than a family that doesn't have a divorce. So we have a divorce, and so that impacts a lot. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Kansas City, and so I have a Kansas City culture as well. So that's a little bit about me and how I see the world and what has formed the way I interface with the world. Anybody else want to share, Alexa?
Sure. So I would say that I identify as the youngest in a family of 5. I view myself as a daughter and a sister and a friend. My parents definitely influenced the way I see things. I'm also a sorority woman, and that has definitely shaped my view of the world and the way that I see women as a force of power and a force of good and a force of change as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
I feel
That's
like yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
It's okay. I feel a connection to a lot of my ancestry in more of my maybe mannerisms and behaviors, but I don't know that I necessarily view myself as being like German or Irish or Scottish or English or all of that stuff. I think it's just more of like, oh, if my temper goes off, we know it's that Irish and German in me colliding.
You mentioned a group that you belong to, the sororities, and I really appreciate that because I was an athlete and I played sports my entire, childhood. And then I ended up playing basketball in college. And so those experiences and those groups also, I see really influence the way I interact with the world because I'm really, and you hear me, Alexis, talk a lot about team and coaching. Like to me, we all belong to teams, whether you're in a family or you're at work, it's all a team. And so that really influences how I see people's relationships and connections. And, we talk a lot about coaching. So feedback is always coaching. When I'm raising my children, I'm coaching them. So that impacts how I talk and how I also interface with people.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, my theater background.
I thought of that
Like, oh
too.
my gosh, like theater is its own culture. Like you got, oh man. Yeah, that definitely has impacted me as well.
Anybody
Definitely.
else want to share? Please feel free to just unmute yourself and talk. Anything that groups Cooper?
Sorry, I've got to step away for just a moment. I'll be back on
Sure,
call in just a minute. I
no
apologize.
problem. Thank you for letting us know. You're fine. Kwame?
Yeah. So I'm from Africa, and as I said earlier, my name is Kwame, and then I'm the 4th of 5,
Mm-hmm.
four boys, and then one lady, one female. Yeah. So growing up, from where I come from, it is not only parents who are like who we look up to or who help us in developing. Anyone who's older than you is considered like someone that can help you or someone that can help shape your future. So there are cases where you may be doing something outside that is not right, and anyone who is older than you can
Can
either
correct
correct
you.
you, yeah, or and or the person can bring you to the house and then report it to your mom that this is what you did. Yeah, so that so that it
I
doesn't be
love
like
it.
that doesn't it's not going to be like when you're in the house you want to be like very cool and calm to your mom, but when you go outside you do other stuff. So from where I come from, it's not like that. Anywhere you are, people are watching you, so whatever you do, like like I don't hear like where I come from, they really they do spank, like
Yeah.
they spank and then like they discipline children a lot. So if you are misbehaving, those kind of discipline and those kind of stuffs are there to help. And then also to religious leaders also play a very good role. Yeah. So we also look up to religious leaders and see them as people that we can also pick inspiration from and also learn from. So they also help shape and then redefine us very well. So yeah, I think yeah, and I think that has really helped me a lot.
I love what you say about when you're outside, like anybody older
Yeah,
than you can
yeah,
correct you
yeah.
or report back to your parents on you.
Yes, yes.
And I love that. It's interesting because in my family, we're more like that.
Oh, okay.
My mom would correct other children and tell their parents, but it's an interesting topic to talk about relative to culture. Very interesting because it's quite varied in America. Now, one of the reasons why is in America, we're not a homogenous culture. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but we're what is considered a low context culture because we have people who come from all over and who are working together and living together. So there isn't one rule from person to person. There are rules within a family, but that differs from family to family because the influences are different. And so we are considered low context. And I can, one of our sessions will get into really what that means. But if you're from a high context culture, there's more continuity, it's more homogenous, and that everybody kind of knows the rules and they follow more of the same rules. And again, I'm generalizing, but where you're from, Kwame, it's a high context culture where there's some rules that kind of go across the culture from neighbor to neighbor and throughout the community. And what you talked about relative to children and people being able to correct children, report on children, that's a great example of a high context culture. And we don't always see this in America, right? In our low context culture, there's not a common belief relative to that. So thank you for sharing that. That's a really good one. Cooper, did you
But,
want to? Oh, go ahead,
sorry,
Kwame. Go ahead.
I guess I'm going to step aside for a few minutes and I'm going to get back again.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Cooper, did you want to share anything about your culture, your personal
Sure.
culture?
Not terribly much different from your guys. Is that I just all my beliefs and just mannerisms I got from my parents, I'd say. We lived in America, in Kansas, all our lives. We do
Where
have
in
some
Kansas?
Irish. Shawnee, I live in the
Okay.
KC metro, just
Yep.
about 30 minutes west of the city. But we do have 60% Irish descendancy, but we've never really seen it that kind of culture passed around in our family. My guess is just because we moved into America such a long time ago, just our ancestors and such, and so it's kind of just Parent
So
to parent basis,
Midwest.
extended family, spread out. Yeah,
Hmm.
Midwest.
Yeah, yeah. And we were just talking about how there are some like generalizations about people from the Midwest, oh, we're friendly, we're helpful, but we're still a low context culture because there's so many different influences and we all really learn a familiar culture. And then when we all go to school, we learn that school's culture. But even in America, what we'll find is when you go from classroom to classroom, you have to learn the rules from each teacher because there will be differences, right? And when you're in a high context culture, there's less of that variance. Like the rules in a classroom are the rules in a classroom, as an example. So that's what makes it really fun to talk about, especially the American culture. I think talking about American culture is really fun and interesting because of the variance, especially when someone from outside the American culture who's come into it, they'll be like, well, why do Americans do this? Or what do Americans do? And it's like there are 20 answers, So, um, but the one I have our first case situation I wanted to go to. And basically, what we do when we look at these case situations is we read them and then we talk about what might be some of the cultural rules at play and what might be some of the cultural bumps. Where are their expectations differing? And so, what I like to do is just read this and discuss it. So, I don't know, Alexa, would you like to just read it out loud and we'll read along?
Sure. A newly arrived volunteer is working in another country at a high school and has been assigned as an advisor to the student government organization, along with a local man who has been teaching at the school for many years and also serves as the vice principal. The new volunteer suggests that they meet on Saturday at 3 o'clock to discuss activities and plans for the student government organization. She believes that the vice principal agreed to the meeting. On Saturday, the volunteer waits for the vice principal at the appointed time and place, but finally leaves at 4:30. When she asks the vice principal about it on Monday, he tells her she should know when yes means yes and yes means no.
This is one of my favorite examples.
It's a good one.
I think for me, it's one of my favorite ones as, again, a Midwest American that, this is really bizarre for me as an American for someone to say, you need to know when yes means yes and yes means no. It was like mind boggling to hear that.
Right.
Cooper, I'm really interested in when you read this, what thoughts you have, like, what questions, what thoughts, what comments.
I do know, I can't name like the specific cultures, but I do know some of the cultures, like being fashionably late is an actual part of the culture. I have no clue which one it is. I've just heard about it,
Yes,
but that's just what popped in my mind when I thought about that.
you're correct. There are certain cultures. So, as an example, in Micronesia, at this is where this is in Ponape. They don't actually have most people didn't wear watches or have clocks. So their time was very fluid, right? It was based on kind of like the sun. Now, if you went to a school, obviously there was a clock at the school, but people were really flexible and they weren't so time oriented. It was based on where the sun was. And so that gives you some leeway right there, right? As to when you're arriving. The other thing that I noticed that even in their language, they didn't really have the verb tenses like we do. You know how we have past perfect, progressive, like all these. I don't know. I studied this. I think we have 15 different tenses because we're so specific. It really changes the meaning depending upon the verb tense that you use. It's not so specific in the Pohnpeian language. So yes, definitely there's the issue of time. Is there anything else that might be at play here? And Ryan, feel free to put something in the chat um, if you have any thoughts on this. So definitely there could be a time issue. I also wondering, this is a newly arrived volunteer who who's probably very excited and is talking to the vice principal. So the vice principal has an office of authority, and it's a male, and
Mhm.
this is a female, and she's a volunteer. So definitely there's going to be a difference of power and position. Um, Alexa, do you want to speak to that at all? What you think might be going on
Yeah,
relative to that?
I'm thinking, there's some, and I just thought too, like, she's also an outsider. She's not from there. So he's thinking, I've got this younger individual who's a woman, who's a volunteer, who's not from here, trying to tell me what to do. Like, I think,
Mhm.
is it all of them? Is it one of them? But in some cultures where it can be more patriarchal, women would not approach a man in any way, shape, or form and say, "Hey, we need to take care of this project. Let's get this done."
Right.
And even though it's not meant in any harmful, malicious way, it's why would you do that? You've
You're new, you know nothing.
you've broken the trust here, if you will. It's
Right.
yeah, and you're young, you don't understand things. Like, I get my time off. Like, I approached you when we were going to work on this project. Like, there's just
Right. And
yeah.
there's so much of here where I see there
Mhm.
are some threads of American culture that are maybe more common coming through here. Even though we say there aren't like necessarily like a lot of rules that apply across the board in America, I think there is this like um, ability for anybody to have an idea. Like what you were talking about, Alexa, that there in other cultures there's a hierarchy, and sometimes you have to wait for the person who's above you to make the suggestion, or you have to put it in a way that allows them to make the suggestion. Um, the other thing would be our work ethic, and this person, the volunteer, thinking, I'm willing to work on Saturday. Can we meet? Maybe not even really seeing it as work because they're excited about it.
Exactly.
Whereas, yeah, the vice principals may be thinking, we don't work on the weekend. I'm not going to meet you on the weekend. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, these types of misunderstandings are going to happen when a person from a low context culture goes into a high context culture, because you can't always know these rules until you face the rules,
Mhm.
until you show up at a meeting and the person doesn't show up. And then you have to try to figure out what's going on. I mean, was there an emergency or was this a message, right? And it turns out it was a message because he said you need to know when yes means yes and yes means no. So that's a really interesting thing because he felt like he told her he wasn't going to be there. And she obviously had is way beyond her ability to understand. And so I'm thinking that this may never be a skill that is developed. Like I myself, because of my culture, I'm not as aware of nonverbal that would tell me that a yes means no, or knowing that I overstepped the boundaries. So it would be by, I think, experience, like having this happen over and over, maybe a few times in that particular culture to start to understand what was going on. Um, but I think that these situations can be very confusing, but there are also opportunities for learning, right?
Yeah.
So, so this actually, just from a theory perspective, um, Paul talks about culture being context, space, and time. And so, context, space, and time. I mentioned just before we discussed this that context, low context, and high context is part of one of the things we discuss when we're talking about generally cultures. And Cooper, you mentioned the notion of time. So time is a big part of culture. So and the question here is, what do you think in general, is America a low context or high context culture, and why? And we already discussed that a little bit. I mentioned that America is a low context culture. Can you tell me why it's a low context culture? What does that mean? Ryan or Cooper or Alexa?
With low context, is that when you're describing it as low context, are you thinking of like the iceberg metaphor you're talking about, where you like have a low context to surface, or because you only see the surface of the culture? Is that the way you're putting it?
So when we talk about
Sorry, let me take a peek at
no,
this.
that's okay. Context is how you contextualize information. Okay. So how you contextualize information is what they mean by low context and high context. So I don't know, can you see this? Yes. Okay. You
Yep.
can see the graphic. So we overly explain everything because I can't assume, Cooper, that you have the same context as me. Because there's so many differences. And in a high context, there's a lot of meaning embedded because the group knows, there's a group knowledge. They value the group. Their relationships are really valued and they cultivate those. This has a little bit from what Kwame was saying about neighbors can correct the children because they know the parents and they can tell the parents. I don't know your parents, Cooper, as a child, so I couldn't tell your parents something you did wrong. And that we see that a lot in American neighborhoods, right? We don't even know who the parents are. But in high context cultures, there tends to be more knowledge of who people are. Really interesting. When I was in Pohnpei, and Pohnpeians in general, there's a lot of people in Pohnpei, even though it's an island and the population is smaller than Kansas City. But they know who everyone is related to. They can tell you, oh, that's so-and-so's cousin and that's so-and-so's brother. I mean, they really know those relationships and those connections. And
Oh.
it's part of their culture to know it. You need to know who people are. And again, this high context, low context, we're generalizing here because it says emphasizes spiral logic, and someone might find that offensive. But it's more like, I would say, spiral isn't meant to be negative. It's just that Americans are very linear, right? From point A to point B to point C is more the way we approach things and how we write and how we describe. One of the best ways I like to describe the difference in American culture being low context and other cultures being high context, and Alexa's heard this example before. I had a student from Saudi Arabia who came to a culture hour.
Not the story I thought.
Well, she came to culture hour and she said, I just don't understand Americans. When I get an invitation to anything, they tell me what to wear, what time to show up, and what to bring. She goes, it's so offensive. I know what to do. When I go to a wedding in Saudi Arabia, I know what to wear. I know what time to go, and I know what to bring. And I thought, wow, right? Like, that's a perfect example. So she was offended because the invitation was telling her what to do, and she felt like, well, I should know this. But can we know in America when you get an invitation? No, we never know. We rely on being told. And when we're not told, we feel a little uncomfortable. We'll call and we'll say, what do I bring? What do I do? Right? So that's very much who we are.
Guilty.
Well, we have to, because if we don't explicitly say, then there's going to be a misunderstanding, expectations aren't going to be met. And that's why we over display meaning through direct communication form. We have to say it, sometimes say it again and again in different ways. Do any of you have experiences with that?
Not quite yet. I'm only been to a few weddings in my lifetime, and just you know how chaotic just the youth are in America. We just kind of go with the flow and just
Yeah.
do whatever the heck whenever we go to events. It hasn't gotten too formal quite just yet.
Cooper, do you remember when you were a child, though, when you were younger and you'd get invited to go do something with a friend? And I've had situations with my own children, and oh, so and so wants me to go to the movie with them. So I have to get on the phone to the parent and say, like, this is how I handle it. I'll say, how much money should I send with Lucas? Because I don't know if the parent's paying or if I'm paying.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll either get one of two answers. The parent will say, oh, the tickets are $10 and he might want popcorn, so I'd send $20 with him. Or the parent will say, oh, don't worry about it. We're paying, because we're inviting, we're going to buy his ticket and we'll buy him a treat if it's okay with you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I find, yes, and this is where people don't always communicate their expectations, and you can
Right.
get stuck in a bad position.
Right.
Cooper, do you remember this with your friends and doing things growing up?
Yeah, that it kind of makes more sense in that context. Like you get the miscommunication that someone else is paying when really it's supposed to be you that's paying, or it's you that's paying when it's supposed to be them paying. I get what you're saying.
I once had a meal with a friend. I was an adult, so it was okay, but the situation was my best friend and her family invited me out at the time. It was a really close friend of mine. And when it came time to pay, they all had separate bills. And so I had a bill. It was a time in my life where I didn't have two pennies to rub together. I was working a really low paying job. I was embarrassed, shocked. I didn't know what to do because when I go out with my parents, they always pay. And if they
Mm-hmm.
ever invited like a friend or a roommate, even my dad would take my entire basketball team out when he would
Mm-hmm.
come to Colorado. He always paid.
Right.
And I was like, I didn't even have the money to pay for that. And I didn't even think to clarify because I had such a big assumption based on how my family operated in our culture that I didn't even know to ask.
Mm. Oh.
Yeah. So it's really, for me, it's interesting the differences in American culture because we face them every day. But the other point on that I'd like to make is what sometimes happens in those situations is then we make a judgment. So it's easy for me to go, oh, they're not very generous because they're not paying for me, right? And
Yeah.
make it this judgment that really isn't fair because they didn't meet my expectations. And this is one of the kind of the really, I think, beautiful outcomes of discussing culture can be is that we can give a lot of people grace even within the American culture, because if we remember that we're all different cultures, we can't assign intent on someone's actions. Okay, they didn't meet our expectations, their expectations are different than mine, but they're operating from a different set of rules. And it doesn't mean that they are um, that I should judge it in a negative way. I should always seek to understand, and it's just different. I was raised differently. It doesn't make me right and my family right or them wrong. It's just different because
Mhm.
in that situation, that family was very kind and very, I would say generous people. They just had different rules of operating. So. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Alexa, can you stop recording for a moment?